submission in particular, as I made mention, by a government civil servant, Mr. Marcus Hennigold, has been, as mentioned, under significant scrutiny. Mr. Hennigold, of course, won the award of $12,500. That award was given to him over other submissions. There were others who received some funds as well for their submissions. We know that one of the former ministers and the PLP MP's son, young Mr. Parent-Chief, was quite impressive for his age. He also got an award as well. But Mr. Hennigold took the top award. But upon closer inspection by many in the community and observers, there was things that were fairly problematic about Mr. Hennigold's submission. There's no doubt that throughout here you can find laudable recommendations. But shortly after the report was made public, prematurely I might add, as has now been conceded, what was the rush to publicize it, I might add, and frankly, I want to explore this a little later, why would an award be given to a submission so riddled with factual errors, typos, etc.? That begs the question, I might add. But nonetheless, we first got wind of potential problems with his submission in the person of my colleague, Mr. David Burke. On page 10 of the report, it noted here that TCD has 4 contracts with GMD for IT consultants.
What you're reading?
From, sorry, Mr. Speaker, from the original submission that was made by Marcus Hennigold.
I see. Magnus.
Magnus. Thank you.
I don't have it, so. Yeah.
Magnus Hennigold.
Magnus Hennigold, yes.
Where he cited that TCD has 4 contracts with GMD for IT consultant. Mr. Burke, of course, went public to defend the interests of his company and noted that they only have one, and also noted, I think quite correctly, that they had provided good service to the government with that one contract. So that was the first inkling that something was not altogether right with this submission. Further on, Mr. Speaker, we have on page 6, of which I made mention in the public domain about, page 7 I should say, that here he makes a comment about, on page 7, that the police should move out of Veritas Place and into the Dame Lois Brown Evans building. He claims that the rent there, as highlighted on page 7 of the submission, is $250,000 per annum. That was the first mention of the police being at Veritas Place. Later he goes on, however, on page 16, to return to the issue of the police prospectively moving out of Veritas Place, and not only claims that the rent in this citation is $156,000, at least $100,000 less than what he originally claimed, only 10 pages before this. And then he says this in parentheses, that the police executives or administrative officers who are in Veritas Place, and I'm not quoting, I'm paraphrasing, are in there with the result of it being a questionable lease, as in the building owned by former PLP MP. That is in parentheses, questionable lease, as in building owned by former PLP MP. Certainly that raised eyebrows. He does, of course, he's speaking here about the need for government to save money, I assume, by pulling many government offices and departments out of private commercial space and into, where possible, government accommodation. Of course, there's no mention here that only 3 or 4 years ago, we had Minister Birch, who quite publicly had stated that he was about trying to do exactly that. Mr. Speaker, I personally took great exception to this. You know, I have an aunt who was former tax commissioner. Tax commissioner's office has been situated over in the Perry building on Church Street. They've been there, I would think, at least a quarter century, give or take a couple of years. That building also houses two other government departments, at least I think 3 ministries, but 3 different departments within that building. Certainly tens of, probably, I would think almost maybe a score of tens of millions of dollars have been generated by the government tenancy of those 3 or 4 departments in that building over the last 25 years. Mr. Perry, we know, has been certainly a former United Bermuda Party member sitting in these chambers.
I don't remember.
Mr. Speaker, I'll give you another example on Parliament Street. There's a building there on the corner of Parliament Street and Victoria Street that houses Child and Family Services. The building has, as an owner or as a major principal in the building, a former speaker for the chamber, who is also a United Bermuda Party member, an MP. Excuse me?
I don't remember. Speak to the chair.
Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, we all know that throughout Hamilton, that there are many, and over the years there have been many government departments and ministries that have been rented to these government departments and that have generated significant monies to these owners, some of whom had very close associations with the United Bermuda Party, or sat on these very same benches. My point is, why point this out that he was a former PLP MP? He did this in no other citation here. He did this in none of the other citations. For example, here he says on page 16, Human Resources. In 129 Front Street, the annual rent for 2013 and 14 is $666,000. There is no mention here of the owner of that building. And so, this speaks to the credibility of the process, and thus reflects on the credibility of SAGE itself, who would choose Mr. Hennigel's submission as being the top submission. We also have on September 11th, Mr. Speaker, by way of the Royal Gazette, Mr. Chris Ferber, who is the president of the Bermuda Industrial Union, also took issue with some of the points raised in the same winning submission. He pointed out, and I quote, on page 6 of the Royal Gazette, that Mr. Hennigel's claim that some ministers have been using government-issued credit card for non-business purposes. As it turned out, the policy is not to allow cabinet ministers and civil servants to use the credit cards locally, and Mr. Hennigel removed the claim in a revised version of the submission. Mr. Ferber goes on. Point 2. Mr. Ferber pointed out another factual error in Mr. Hennigel's submission, the claim that bus drivers who fill in for colleagues on furlough will be paid time and a half. In fact, the recently concluded agreement between government and its employees specifically provides that the 12 days of furlough unpaid and unworked days will be filled in at straight time. But see, you know what I think, Mr. Speaker? I believe that for those who may have made that decision on the part of SAGE, they took some of this as red meat, confirming their worst fears about government and those who man and provide its services to Bermuda. And certainly Mr. Hennigel gave them enough red meat to have earned his designation as being the best submission. But the shame of this is, as I alluded, is that having done so, the SAGE Commission is now tied at the hem to the submission, and its impact in terms of causing a diminution of credibility in the work of the SAGE Commission on the part of Bermuda's people. That is what has been the greatest damage here. I am also saddened by the fact that having tried to make it appear in the public eye, again, this is where we come to the red meat part of this, that Mr. Hudson's so-called building. I might add, Mr. Hudson doesn't own the building. It's owned by a company, of course. But that building only got the tenants in there, this being the police administration at various levels, I guess at the hierarchy there, at the executive level, because of PLP, another example of PLP cronyism. A former PLP MP, he states. Come on. The fact of the matter is that Mr. Hudson, at the time of that lease being signed, with the company who runs Veritas Place, had been out of government for at least 5 or 6 years, as you would know. Are they now saying that progressive Labour Party members or even OBA members, having left the government, cannot do business with the government? No, yeah, you did, but in that case, in many cases, they did it while they were in government, on the benches. And we will note, Mr. Speaker, that it is an alliance, and so the legacy of the United Bermuda Party is still with us. It's an alliance between the BDA and the UBP. I don't know how, Mr. Speaker, I don't know how the $33 million man, Mr. Duperow, is going to deal with this next week, but I think that it's incumbent upon the Sales Commission to try to restore its credibility amongst Bermudians by addressing this issue. I think it'd be a great public relations bonus or plus for the State Commission to request that those funds that were given to Mr. Hennigo be returned to them so they can give it to a more worthy person, that being young Mr. Parachute and his submission. Because what we see here doesn't cut it. Mr. Speaker, I just want to say this again, and I guess I'll come full circle. Like I said, on the one hand, we have an organization, I think it's worth repeating, that is tasked with, during these times, and it's a laudable goal, to achieve greater efficiency in government. To, as a result of that, to see higher productivity, so that the government can provide the level of services that the Bermudian people have come to expect while trying to meet the goal of debt and deficit reduction.